My name's Kimberly Tice, and I'm the Executive Director with Ohio AEYC. And we're really excited that Elisa Huss-Hage is able to join us today. She worked on this part of the Power to the Profession project, was the chair of it. Just as we've been here, you see on the first slide, we just ask that we're going to discuss some of these things afterwards, and we'll copy this over into the chat box. But we'd like you to, pay attention to what it means, what leveling means, what that term is and what it means. We'd ask you to listen for how leveling might impact your professional role or your setting, and we're going to discuss that afterwards. So I'm not sure who's got control of the slides, if that's Elisa or Laura. We can go ahead and move to the first slide, and I'll let Elisa introduce herself and we'll take it from there. If you have comments or questions throughout, if it's an appropriate place, you're welcome to take yourself off mute and ask Elisa a question, or you can also put it in the chat box and we'll make sure she hears it when she takes a pause before going to another section. So there we go.
All right. With that, I'm gonna give this a shot. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to spend a little time with you this Friday afternoon. As Kim said, now my little internet thing is saying it's unstable. So I'm hoping I want to thank Laura and Pam and Kim and Lisa and Belinda for practicing with me Wednesday. As my students will tell you, technology is not my strength, and they're always very happy to let me know that I need to get into this, technology world in which we live, but I'm doing it kicking and screaming. Nonetheless, here I am on this Zoom call, and I'm really happy to be able to share with you where P2P has guided the standards and competencies for teacher preparation. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background about and actually go into some of the specifics. So it might feel like it's a little bit weedy, that we're getting kind of deeper than your knowledge base will take you. But I hope that you're able to take this content and help figure out how this is going to continue to move our profession forward. So a little bit about myself. There I am moving too fast. So I am privileged to be a professor at Owens Community College. And about 15 years ago, AEYC began an initiative to accredit higher education programs that offer associate degrees. For those who pilot program, Owens was the first in Ohio to become accredited. So we've been through the accreditation process twice. We're about to be in self-study for our third opportunity to be accredited. But that was really the first time that anyone in a national way was saying, here are the standards of our profession, and this is what we should use to guide the preparation of high-quality teachers working with those who teach young children and work with those families. So as a part of that work, Owens afforded me the opportunity to be involved on the national level by being a peer reviewer, going to visit other institutions. I continually came back feeling so good about what we have going on at Owens. As Rian came on as AEYC's executive director and she was doing some strategic work, I realized that there wasn't a community college member sitting on the governing board. So I really stepped outside of my comfort zone and threw my name in the hat to run for governing board. And what it has proven to be is really the highlight of my professional career. And I've been at this a long time, and a lot of those of you on the call know, because you've been around since our children were babies, and my husband was on Ohio's governing board, and now we've got a a daughter who's been teaching for 10 years and another one who just got married. So we've been at this a long time. And to be able to be a part of the work at this point in time is just really pivotal. Power to the Profession is really going to transform early childhood teaching and preparing teachers, the workforce that we work with. And so today's conversation, I'm going to set the stage initially here with talking a little bit about Power to the Profession and what this means for the work that we do. So, yep, here I go, playing with this. Okay, so Power to the Profession has continued to make progress with the end goal of delivering and implementing a unified framework of our profession. It has implications for what we do in preparing educators that are related to the early childhood education professional standards and competencies that are anticipated to be adopted as the national standards as one of the P2P outcomes. So, not really knowing what everybody's educational base is, I just wanted to share a little bit of information about Power to the Profession. So there were, the initiative was first brought about when NAEYC.
So I think that's all really good reflection, Amber.
When NAEYC put out a call, what was there a need for this to happen? And there was some grant funding that was with the 15 task force organizations, and those are listed on the PowerPoint right now. In addition, there are 35 stakeholder organizations, and as the task force has put out the decision cycles, with each decision cycles or series of decision cycles, we as an early childhood field have had an opportunity to weigh in and be engaged in the process. So here are the decision cycles. The first one being the distinct profession and our role in society. The other 8 are rolled out, but specifically what we're going to address today have to do with knowledge and skills, required preparation and qualifications, professional specializations, and professional responsibilities. What will be on the heels of what's being done now will be the decision cycles around compensation, accountability, and infrastructure and resources. I don't think anyone on this call will disagree that, you know, this is all lovely and wonderful. We can improve quality of teaching, preparation, we can improve the quality of instruction we offer to young children and their families. But if we don't have some real national infrastructure changes about how we are supporting these causes, where the compensation is going to be, all of this work is going to be for naught. So at the end of the day, this is really about helping us put in place some things that policymakers are going to be able to use. We're going to have data that's going to back all this work that's been done so that we can justify our system being supported in a way that K-12 has been supported for years. So I guess let me pause there. Does anybody have any questions? And I know that the Ohio AEYC team has some real deep knowledge. I mean, we're so excited that Ohio is one of the states leading the charge around P2P coming to a state level and starting to impact our own state policies. Does anybody have any questions that they might want to address before I really move into the professional standards and competencies, just around Power to the Profession in general?
Elisa, this is Christy at Family Council. So I don't think I have questions yet because I'm looking forward to just learning more. But I am curious about the connection in Ohio between Ohio AEYC and the Ohio Head Start Association. They're meeting this week, and we had extensive discussion about workforce. And so I brought up Power to the Profession in this webinar at the meeting. And they said that They are working at the state level in some way, and at the Head Start Collaboration Office, Anita Armstrong is involved in some way. But I just really want to make sure those collaborations are really strong and clear so that people are connecting the dots and not trying to do separate sort of siloed approaches to this workforce crisis.
Christy,
As
this
we've
is
done
Kim,
for
and I can respond to that for you.
Yeah, Kim,
Yeah, I can respond to that for you. Two things. One,
Kim, you can address that a little better than I am, sure.
okay, I'll go ahead. Two things. One, at the national level, the National Head Start Association is one of the stakeholders. So they themselves have a national organization that should be filtering this to them. But we have worked very closely with the Ohio Head Start Association. Barb Haxton is aware that we're doing Power to the Profession. Julie Stone, I don't think she's on the call today, but she's been at the meetings and engaged in it. And we've been making sure that we're very connected. Anita Armstrong from the Ohio Head Start Collaboration Office, because hers is collaboration between Head Start and childcare. She's provided us a small amount of funding so that we can do this work together. So she's also getting regular updates, and we've provided a presentation to her steering committee. But we'd be more than happy to hear more ways that you think we might connect with the Head Start community, because this really is about the entire profession.
And we just had, well, it would have been 2 Fridays ago, we had a higher education summit that was specific to higher ed institutions who prepare teachers of young children, and Anita was there. And so I think that there's a very intentional understanding that this work really does need to be done in collaboration of one another. We've lived and existed in these silos for so long that I think everybody's anxious and ready to be all on the same page and moving forward. Is that accurate, Kim, to say that?
It is, because one of the biggest goals of Power to the Profession is to have a unifying framework and a common language among the entire profession. So as we create these policy asks, that we're able to use similar language and have similar goals to move this work forward. So that's why it's so critical, I believe, that AEYC established this work by making sure they're like the stakeholders that you see: National Family and Child Care Association, higher education, state administrators. So they really are trying to make sure that everybody is touched by this and engaged in this. But we're just scratching the surface. We've been doing not only these meetings, but we've been asked to go out and do meetings for different groups that have requested, and we're very open to that. So, anyone who's on the call who wants assistance in sharing this, just connect with one of us and we'll be happy to do that.
Thank you both.
I also think something that's important on our end and the different organizations that we're a part of, because there's a whole different network of different organizations in early childhood. So here at Ohio State, one thing that's really important in our early childhood programs is really fighting for equal pay for our teachers too. And so doing things on the state level, but also doing things in our organizational level. So I know we're technically med center employees at our center versus the other childcare center OSU, which is on the other side of the university, but having the classifications of we have an early childhood teacher 1 position and we have an early childhood teacher 2 position. And I think even those little things of kind of following in line with what we're doing with Power to the Profession and setting up those systems, that helps us pay our teachers more. So having those qualifications and having those standards laid out is really nice, because you come in as a professional and you're applying for an early childhood teacher job. And there's a difference between an early childhood teacher 1 and an early childhood teacher 2. So someone who did go and get their bachelor's in early childhood is getting paid as equal as best as we can for that profession. And that's something we can do on our level as organizations. So I know, like, and I think it's important too, like someone who gets an early childhood degree, we have like a formula of how they get paid. They get paid a little bit more than someone who might just have a regular bachelor's. And I think that's important. That's important that we're making that distinction of you went to school for this and this is something that you're doing, you deserve to get paid a little bit more. So I think it's really important that, yes, we're doing stuff on this level with government and advocacy, but we also, it starts with us too. So how can we set up our systems in the organizations that we're in that is fighting for teachers, that is setting them up and providing procedural safeguards that they're being taken care of.
That's great. Yep. Yeah, as we go through this, please think of what you can do in your own settings and share what's happening there. Okay, Elisa, you want to go on unless anybody else has a comment or question?
Troy, that's right in line with the leveling that that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. How we're, in this unifying framework, we're going to look at 3 levels of the profession and how each of those have very distinct roles and responsibilities, and along with that will come established compensation. So maybe we'll all be using your model in the near future for what this can look like on a grander scale. So thank you for sharing that. And Chris, thank you for your question as well. So let's start by talking about what the actual position is. So if you're familiar with position statements, there always has to be, the core of what that position is. So the position around early childhood aided here. Early childhood educators are critical to realizing the early childhood profession's vision for each and every young child, birth through age 8, to have equitable access to high quality learning and caring environments. As such, there is a core body of knowledge, skills, values, and dispositions that early childhood educators must demonstrate to effectively promote the development, learning, and well-being of young children. So that's the core of what these standards say. We move forward from there, and now I'm not able to move my slide presentation.
Try hitting the right arrow on your keyboard.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Oh.
It seems to be frozen. All right.
Can she minimize it and then kind of bring it back up and see if it unfreezes it?
Yeah, probably. So. Can you do anything on your screen, Elisa?
Nope. So much for practicing. Now, let's see.
One other thought would be if you stop screen sharing and start it again, and if not, you still may be able to go through it because people were able to, we did send the PowerPoint in advance, so maybe people can, or maybe Laura, can you take over screen sharing? Do you have the PowerPoint?
Oh, there we go. Can you
There we
see
go.
it now?
It moved, yay.
Can you see it now?
Yep, it's moving.
Is it moving?
It is.
Yes.
Okay, and you can still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Thank you for
Take
your
a
patience,
breath,
everybody.
everybody.
Oh gosh. All right. So we also have a purpose, and the purpose for these agreed upon standards and competencies. And again, thinking of your work in your own places of employment, the field, the part of the field in which you focus your energy. The purpose of these standards is to present an essential body of knowledge, skills, dispositions, and practices required of all early childhood educators working with children from birth through age 8 across all early learning centers. So what we're saying in this is that we have this agreed upon group of skills and dispositions that we feel are the underlying foundation, important skills, set of knowledge that we all share as a profession.
Mhm. Yep. Poor Elisa, she's frozen again.
Aw, we lost Elisa.
Just when we think technology is going well.
Right.
Um, I don't know if any of our staff is able to pull up the PowerPoint. If not, we maybe could just, we could give Elisa a minute to sign back in and see what happens, but otherwise, maybe we could continue to go through it. Of course, we haven't had this tech problem on any of our calls yet, so we apologize to you. There's a first time for everything. So let's see here.
I have the handouts, but not the original PowerPoint saved on my computer.
Okay, well, I think even the handouts would work.
Okay.
I'm trying to find it, Kim.
Yeah, Laura's got it. Are you able to make the screen any larger? If not, we'll just go with what we have.
Let me try.
And it looks like Belinda might be calling her to try to get her to call in, because then we could move the screen for her.
Right. So Belinda, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but
This is Belinda, and I am on the phone with Elisa.
I was going to say, because she's having internet problems, if you could send her the phone number,
That's what I'm
then
doing.
we could go through the slides and she wouldn't have the internet issue.
Yes, Laura. She said Laura will do the slides, and she'll talk to us from her cell phone. That'll be great. She's going to get on as soon as I give her the number.
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So I think that we can, oops. We lost your screen. There we go. So she was on the purpose of these. And I think what I would say while we're waiting for her is, in each of these, personally, I'm looking for what resonates for me. And I think this resonates even for what Christy said earlier, is practice is required of all early childhood educators. And as we talked about in other decision cycles, all early childhood educators, again, it regards those who are willing to commit to meet the professional standards of the field. And so it's not by sectors, because it is very confusing right now that you may have a very different requirement for if you teach in a ODE public preschool setting than if you are teaching the same age children in a private childcare center. And it can be different if you work in Utah versus Ohio. So one of those goals, again, is that this will be unified, so that I think also as a former center director, when I read this, I'm like, it would feel so good to have every educator coming to me and knowing that they all had the same, we're coming out of college with the same agreed upon standards and competencies. Because I know there were certain colleges who shall not be named that I would prefer not to hire from, and other colleges that I was very excited when I saw a resume come my way. Pam, do you have anything to add to that, or Lisa, while we're waiting?
I think it's really important, because we've even discussed through Power to the Profession that it's even hard to talk with leadership when we're not comparing apples to apples. So this gives me hope, so that moving forward, when we're talking about what expectations are for what we're meaning by teacher, that doesn't vary from setting to setting, location to location, funding stream to funding stream. Because part of our problem in getting some of the support has been our consumers are confused by our own language and discrepancies between programs as to how we define that. And I think Troy pointed that out well. even within his larger institution at Ohio State University, because I remember running our program within the hospital, and there just wasn't the equity there. So I feel it gives us hope.
Yeah. So Belinda, will Elisa let us know when she's been able to join by phone?
Yes, she is literally calling in right now.
I'm back on.
There you go. Okay.
Oh my gosh. So much for the technology practice. I am very sorry, everybody.
Okay.
We
It's
are
okay.
raining.
We're not friends.
Yes, that's right.
We're raining here in Northwest Ohio, and needless to say, we don't have the greatest internet connection to begin with. So, the good news is you don't have.
Elisa, take a breath, and when you go
All
back
right.
and tell your students, you'll have a perfect example to tell them to always have backup and be prepared and go with the flow, and it'll be a real life experience to share with them.
That's right.
It's
right.
It's early childhood. Anything can happen.
That's right.
Be prepared for it all. So, yeah, so the good news is you still have to listen to me, but you don't have to look at me. So there you go.
So, Elisa, just let Laura know when you're finished with a slide and want to go to the next one. It'll be a tiny bit awkward, but I think we'll be fine.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your understanding, everybody. So, Laura, I think we're still on slide 8, yes?
Oops.
That's where I have you at now, yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm just going to finish up and we'll move forward with that and we'll go from there.
Okay.
So the purpose of this agreed upon standards and competencies is to serve as the core foundational early childhood standards and competencies from the field from which states and professional development systems can address their specific context. So you notice very specifically the use of the words professional development systems. This is not just meant for higher education institutions. This is meant for any system that addresses preparing or keeping those already in the field up to date on best practices, developmentally appropriate practice, what we do to work with children and families, child development, and all the things that we see as those foundational standards of working with children and families. Okay, Laura. So why do we need to have agreed upon standards and competencies? Ideally, our field will use them to align these critical professional and policy structures. So as we saw in that slide that had all the task force organizations, and Christy pointed out with Head Start, but there are many others. We've got public school teaching unions at the table. We've got the Council for Recognition that prepares those with CDAs. We have the professional organization that supports faculty who are preparing students at the BA level. We have an organization that supports those who are preparing associate degrees. So we're really looking at, across the country, how do we align these standards so that everyone in the field is really using and supporting the same work so that we have equitable care and equitable education going on across the country for all children and families. So the intent is for state and national early childhood educator credentials and related qualification recommendations or requirements for those to align with this unified structure. Educator licensing assessments will be based on these standards and competencies that we will agree upon as a field. Hiring and performance evaluations for those working in early learning settings will be aligned with these standards and competencies. Professional development, national accreditation of early childhood professional preparation programs. And then also we would expect that these agreed upon standards would also support articulation agreements between the levels and types of professional preparation and development programs. Go ahead, Laura. So Power to the Profession has provided very specific guidance around what this is, how this is supposed to happen. So when the task force initially started meeting, am I the one setting off that noise?
Are you?
Try it now.
Yeah.
Okay. So when the Power to the Profession task force initially began its thoughts around some of this language, they looked at, there are already skills and competencies related to various sectors of our field. So for example, the CDA already has some language that they use. The higher ed accreditation system already had language that they used. And basically what the task force did was they looked at all the variety of standards and competencies that people have used across the systems and across the preparation opportunities. And they said, you know, there are already good things here. Let's not start with a blank slate. And the task force organizations voted and agreed that the standards that AEYC had created and were using for accreditation, which were the 2010 standards, were actually a good place to start. So that is in fact the document that the task force said, we're going to begin with these. Let's then reiterate and re-engage our communities to make sure that this 2010 version actually also includes some other important concepts that are not in place. So for one thing, they said that the standards for the profession needed to reflect newly defined levels of the profession, and that would be the leveling that you've heard mentioned. So ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3 are the three defined levels of the profession as were outlined and approved by Power to the Profession in decision cycles 3, 4, and 5. While doing that, we looked at other standards of other national organizations, and I'll use the DEC-CEC standards as an example. So the DEC-CE standards were looked at as we were looking at the revisions of the NAEYC standards to assure that we reflected in our standards a deep understanding of working with students who weren't typically developing. So if you were familiar with the old standards and you're going to look now at the new standards, you would see a deeper understanding, a deeper intentionality around working with cultural, linguistic, ability diverse children and families. That came directly from the P2P workforce. They said, these standards are great, but we really want to make sure that we reflect across all settings a real intentionality about working with every child and family. So we're leveraging the standards from other national organizations and wrapped them into the standards that we're going to be talking more specifically about today. So other guidance that Power to the Profession gave this group that were working on the revisions of the standards was that we needed to address some gaps that were identified in the IOM report. And we're making an assumption that everyone on this call has an understanding of the IOM report. If not, I would suggest that you go back and you look that up, because that really, the IOM report is really what was the impetus for Power to the Profession to even begin. That we recognize some very important gaps that we needed to address in our profession, and it's way more than just compensation. It's about really having a deeper understanding for all the children and families that we're working with. So the other thing that was given to us as our charge was to rebrand and elevate the standards. And basically what that means is that the governing board of NAEYC voted to take NAEYC off the title of the standards and make these the standards of the profession. So there's still conversation around if NAEYC's name will be on it anywhere, because initially the standards came from NAEYC. But as we're moving forward, as far as the unification of this work goes, there's real discussion that the standards will come out and they're branded as standards of the profession, and that is the brand that these will move forward. And that will just be the title. Laura, you could move it forward. So just as an understanding of the leadership and how this happened. So because the NAEYC position statement was where this all started, the Governing Board Early Learning Systems Committee developed and is working on the iterations of the draft. The position statement work group, which included power to the profession representatives, worked together to inform the draft. So if you've been involved and you've paid attention, and admittedly, members of NAEYC in particular, but if you're also members of the other task force organizations, you've kind of been swamped with opportunities to contribute your voice to this work. But the position statement work group initially started working in January of 2018. And when we came together, we took those NAEYC standards and competencies with the recommendations that the Power to the Profession work group gave us, the Power to the Profession task force gave us, and we set out the initial revisions of this draft. Once the draft was out and the field had an opportunity to reflect upon and add their voice to the work, it came back to the work group, and we used that feedback to inform the next draft. So right now, the second draft is out for public comment. Included in this particular draft is a more developed leveling. When the last iteration came out, the ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3 were present, but we realized as a work group that it really needed to have better differentiation of what the three levels look like. And so we really depended on the field to give us feedback so that the next iteration could be stronger. So, and I'll fill in a little bit more about the process and where we're at right now in a moment. But ultimately, the NAEYC governing board for its work will still approve the final draft because it still will sit as a position statement of NAEYC's organization. We've got 5 foundational position statements, and one of them are the standards used to accredit early childhood centers. One of them is our code of ethical conduct. One of them is the position statement on developmentally appropriate practice. The fourth is our position statement that's brand new and out, and hopefully some of you have become familiarizing yourself with it, our position statement on equity, which we're very proud of, and we hope it really informs a lot of folks in the field. But that fifth one will still remain these standards for the profession, because ultimately NAEYC will still be accrediting higher education programs. So we still want to hold these standards as one of our guiding documents and foundational position statements. So just to have you have a little better understanding of the competencies work group. So on the left-hand column, you see there the task force organization. So even though there were 15 task force organizations, 5 of them wanted to move forward to be a part of the work group as we revised the standards and competencies for the field. So for those of you, you know, this alphabet soup in which we work in our field, Access is the professional development organization for faculty members who prepare associate degree teachers. The Council for Professional Recognition is the group that prepares CDA professionals. DEC, CEC is the Department of Early Childhood Council for Exceptional Children. NAECTE would be the sister to Access, the bachelor's degreed teachers in the professional organization that supports them. And then 0 to 3, many of you familiar with. So because these standards prepare the field for birth through age 8, 0 to 3 really wanted to make sure their voice was at that table. In addition, you'll see on the right-hand column, the other organizations and people who sat at the table as a part of this competencies work group. So both NAEYC and the P2P task force vetted the other organizations and individuals to assure that we really covered the field when we were looking at making sure that every voice that was going to touch these standards and competencies, that there would be opportunities to make sure it was, you know, really covered thoroughly. You'll see at the third bullet point, NAEYC Early Learning Systems Committee. So that committee includes not only members of NAEYC Governing Board, but there are 4 additional members, 2 governing board members that sit at that governing board table that represent work being done within NAEYC. So the competencies work group was very, very deep, and as far as expertise, I was quite humbled to be a part of these groups as we really looked at making sure that these reflected our field, but I really feel very strongly that we had a very deep and broad representation at the table as we looked at these the next versions of the competencies and standards to reflect the field. Okay, Laura. So what stayed the same? Again, not really knowing what folks know about the standards and competencies and if you've ever looked at them. I'm going to guess those of you on the call who were educated by institutions that use these standards or that might already have been accredited, you'll be familiar with the language. Those of you who are not, this might be brand new to you. But there are some things that that stayed the same as far as how they looked. So the categories of the standard remained the same. And there were initially 6 standards, and there remain 6 standards. The flow of the competencies within each standard also stayed the same. So the language that you'll see as we move into the specific standards, you'll notice that they start, there's a hierarchy of understanding and application. So you start in the standard with a know and understand, and you move to apply. So to put that in the context of like my work as a faculty member in a community college, when I'm preparing students in our beginning level classes, you would see us addressing a standard at the know and understand level. But then as we move to our higher level classes, like our methods classes and our student teaching, you would see us addressing these standards at an application level. So these could be easily understood and used in the PD systems that states have, or in PD systems that some of you who are directors might already have in place. You can't apply until you know. And so it's a very intentional way that these were designed so that we know that there's a foundational understanding first of the standards, and then we move towards application. The other thing that stayed the same was the core content. Both the Power to the Profession Task Force and the work group had a very clear and supportive attitude toward what was already in place. There were these areas, like I've already mentioned, around cultural and linguistic and ability diversity that we had to, really go a little deeper on. But the basic core content of each standard has remained the same. So what has changed? As we mentioned, the position statement title will be adjusted so that it reflects that these are the standards for the field, not just NAEYC standards. There will be a streamlined contextual and introductory content. And basically what that is, and when you see the document, and we'll share a link so that you can go in and actually offer feedback, as it's open right now for feedback. But we want to make sure folks have that underlying understanding of how these should be used. There are new sections that are added around recommendations. So as we've looked to make sure that all the position statements align with one another, we make sure that there are recommendations there for early childhood educators. There are recommendations there for policymakers. There are recommendations there for directors and administrators. There are recommendations there for those who are preparing folks for the field. So that whole section on recommendations is really to help the various sectors of our field understand how they can and should be using these standards relative to the particular hat that they wear. Previously, the key element, we used to call underneath each of the standards, there were key elements. So you'd have standard 1, and then there would be 1A, and we called those key elements. We're now shifting that language so that it better reflects what they truly are with the work that we do. So those are now called key competencies. And included in that, there are additional key competencies in many standards, and that will reflect the recommendations that the task force made around updating and making sure that we are reflecting what is going on in the world today as we prepare folks to work in the field. We'll also notice that there is content that is updated, improved use of how we use technology, improved understanding of how we support families, every family and every child. So here's a high-level summary of the changes in the standards. There is an elevated focus on understanding child development within a cultural context. Our work around that was really guided by the equity statement that has a position statement that NAEYC Governing Board has recently adopted. We wanted to make sure that these standards reflected that equity work that was done. So there's some new language around that. There's an elevated focus on valuing the diversity of families and how we engage in reciprocal, responsive relationships with families. So as we're preparing those to work with families, that there's a respect and understanding for those, the culture of each family and how we can respond to a cultural context instead of expecting them to adapt to what might be our own. We want to make sure that assessments are used to inform educators and our practice. There's a stronger focus on using cultural and linguistically appropriate assessments. We want to make sure that teaching practices are culturally, linguistically, and ability appropriate. So that is a focus that is addressed in this high-level summary of the standards. There's an improved emphasis on content knowledge and what teachers of young children need to know related to the content they'll be teaching children, and the kinds of pedagogical content knowledge that we need to have our own basic understanding and content in order to be able to teach. And then the professionalism standard is an improved reflection on how we as early childhood professionals should be advocates and how we need to reflect on our own practice and how we communicate in a professional way. So that's a very high-level summary of some of the changes that were made to the standards. So I'm feeling like I'm at a bit of a disadvantage not being connected to all of you. Are there any questions? I can't see the chat box. Just kind of before I move on to the leveling, I'm talking an awful lot. Are there questions, or am I losing folks kind of in the details?
Elisa, this is Christy. I'm good with you so far. I think I just need to be able to spend some time with the draft myself so I can see some of this work in more detail, but you're doing a great job.
And there are no questions that have come up in the chat box.
Okay. Well, then, thank you, Christy. By the way, I appreciate your support there. So why don't we then just move on to the next piece, which is, as if revising standards isn't enough, there's more. So about the leveling. The leveling is based on the scopes of practice for ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3 as outlined in decision cycles 3, 4, and 5 of Power to the Profession. So if you need to get up to speed, we are now calling ourselves educators. We've landed on early childhood educators. That is our title. And within that profession, we are saying that there are 3 levels of the profession, ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3. Each of those levels have a scope of practice, a professional preparation that reflects what is appropriate for that level, the roles and responsibilities of that level of professionalism in the field. And then along with it will also come the competence. The compensation that would be appropriate for that level of the field. So this will serve as a guide to help early childhood ecosystems, practitioners, employers, professional preparation programs, accreditors, licensing bodies, to understand the necessary breadth and depth of the standards and competencies that they need to master or align to in their particular professional roles. So moving on then to each of the standards. So you'll see here, Standard 1, Child Development and Learning in Context. I'm not going to read through all 4 of those bullets, but just to help you with an understanding. So there are 6 standards. Standard 1 is child development and learning in context. There are 4 specific competencies. 1A is listed there. 1B, which is in red because it is a new competency within Standard 1 based on these revisions and the guidance given from Power to the Profession. And you'll see that it reflects some of the comments that I've made already around appreciation and understanding of language, cultural, linguistic ability differences. So it's understand and value each child as an individual with unique developmental variations, ability to make choices, strengths, interests, challenges, and approaches to learning, experiences, and abilities. So that had previously not been a key element, which is what it had been called, but it is now included as a competency related to Standard 1. Now, staying on Standard 1 then, just to apply the leveling, so as you go through each of the standards, and I've not included ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3 here because they have just gone out for public comment and we've not landed on those. So I encourage you, especially there are many of you on this call who are in the field and who are responsible in ways of hiring and leadership and direction of child care centers and home care centers, or in preparation of teacher preparation programs. What you'll see in the document that's currently posted under 1A, you will then see what will this look like for an ECE1? What will this look like for an ECE2? What will this look like for an ECE3? It's been very clearly defined. And how those ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3 were created basically was, after these went out the first time for comment, we really didn't get a lot of feedback from the field. I think it was overwhelming, quite frankly, because we put the standards and the leveling out at the same time. And it was a lot for people to process who weren't familiar with kind of the depth and breadth of the standards. So Power to the Profession Task Force and NAEYC convened a group of people from each of those 3 sectors of the field. So ECE1 folks were invited, ECE2 folks were invited, ECE3 folks were invited. There were maybe 25 people who were convened to put together what would the roles and responsibilities look like specific to each of the 3 levels in the field. So I strongly encourage you, we're doing this broad overview of what the standards are and what the revisions to the standards are, but it goes deeper than that with this next iteration and what is out for public comment right now to include those 3 elements of the leveling. So I think of Christy Hannon and her role of the Lucas County Family First Council, and you know, she's probably hiring people who have CDAs, and she's hiring people who are ECE1s, EC2s, and EC3s. So it's really important that each of you with your lens looks at the differentiation of those 3 to make sure that we've landed in the right place with those levels. Laura, if you'd move it on to Standard 2 then. So then again, let's just a broad overview. The thing that is primarily changed is what's highlighted there in red. Use community resources to support young children's learning and development and to support families as they build partnerships between early learning settings, schools, and community assistance and agencies. So the 2A and 2B, those competencies basically remain the same. 2C is an elevated understanding of community resources and building partnerships with families. Standard 3. Standard 3, child observation, documentation, and assessment. Again, Standard 3, that standard remains the same. We've added 3C, which is to use screening and assessment tools in ways that are ethically grounded, developmentally, culturally, and linguistically appropriate to document developmental progress and promote positive outcomes for each child. The other 3 basically remained the same. For Standard 4, the title of Standard 4 is Developmentally, Culturally, and Linguistically Appropriate Teaching Strategies. So Standard 4 is really around teaching practices. What are the things that I do as a teacher to assure that children are learning? So it's my specific practices. So you'll see 4A, using positive, caring, supportive relationships. 4B is where we really made a shift to include and elevate these things, understanding and using teaching skills that are responsive to the learning trajectory of young children and to the needs of each child. Recognize differentiated instruction, incorporating play. That was a theme that came up over and over and over again by a number of experts across the field. They wanted to assure that we had the word play as a part of teaching strategies, because what we all know is that, you know, with all of the pressure that we have to show that, you know, outcomes are being met, we've lost track of the value of play as a teaching tool. So that word is in there very intentionally, the way that it's used, incorporating play as a core teaching practice. So we want to, you know, I guess I just wanted to point out that 4B, there was a lot of discussion and important conversation around what are some of those teaching tools and what that should look like. The use of executive function skills, or incorporating the development of executive function skills, was also something that folks wanted to make sure was included. So that is what you see reflected in 4B. And then something that remained the same was just using a broad repertoire of developmentally appropriate, culturally and linguistically relevant, anti-biased, evidence-based teaching skills and strategies, and really focusing on the universal design for creating valuable learning environments. So before we go on to Standard 5, I got a cue from Belinda that there were a couple of questions. So why don't we address the questions?
So one of the questions is, how do these standards mesh with the standards for obtaining an ECE professional teaching license in the state of Ohio? Do you want me to, read it again? Should I read it again?
Nope, I got it.
Okay.
I got it. So that's an excellent question.
That was from Hillary Harper.
Hi, Hillary. Thank you for the question. So how do these align with what we're currently using for state licensure? Well, because this is kind of a new initiative, and really we're working to help those who have control over that, both at the Ohio Department of Education and the Ohio Department of Higher Education. We're sort of, and we had a summit 2 weeks ago where all these folks were at the table. We're really trying to impress upon them the importance of recognizing these national standards as the standards. That shift has not happened yet. And if not knowing your role specifically, Hillary, but what you might know right now is the state licensure for Ohio just went to, for the bachelor's license, just went PK to grade 5. And that all happened very much under the radar and quite to the displeasure of many of us in the field. So we have some work to do in Ohio. Right now, the standards that are being used were created based off of the previous NAEYC standards. You'll notice the language is very much the same. The standards are in a different order. There are different words being used here or there. But basically, they use the NAEYC standards to create the Ohio teacher preparation standards. So our hope is, as this Power to the Profession initiative continues, and we're looking at dialing the legislature in on what's going on, which is why it's important that we have this unifying framework. We're hoping that Ohio is going to be one of those states at the forefront adopting these standards, that these will be the standards used for teaching licensure, anything that's being done around professional preparation of the field, the core knowledge and competencies that we're currently using. I mean, my hope and dream would be that these standards would be used in replacing all of those things. Now, I know we're a long way from there, but how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
I'll tell you why I ask, and that's just because as somebody who has that pre-K through 3 licensure as well as a special ed licensure, when I got out of college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. And so I think it is going to be really important that if we're saying that these are the standards we want to hold early childhood educators to, that the licensure gets on board with that, because again, if you want to hire these highly qualified people, you want them to understand already out the gate that whether they're preschool, pre-K, kindergarten, first, second, or third, this is what you're looking for. And so that's why I asked that, because I went from teaching in an elementary setting to working in a child care setting, a special needs setting, and there's no level playing field for anything. I've gone back to school probably, I think, 4 or 5 different times now because of different requirements, like if you want to teach special ed, if you want to do this. So that's why I asked.
Yep, it's a great question. And the State Department of Higher Ed folks were at the Higher Ed Summit. They're very aware of what's going on with P2P. I really think, this is where we're all going to need to start wearing our advocacy hats, and we're going to need to, be contacting the folks who are going to be the ones who are going to change the law, because that's what's going to have to happen here. But the task force is very aware of the inconsistencies from state to state. Another good example is Ohio offers a pre-K associate teaching license. Of course, I know that because I teach associate degree students, but there are very, very few people in our state that even know that teaching license exists, and there are very few other states that even offer such a license. So the inconsistencies from state to state are clear, and it's really the impetus for the Power to the Profession movement in the first place. We want to make sure that across the country, every teacher is being prepared in the same, way with the same standards. So that is very much at the forefront of why this work is being done. So thank you for being in tune with that.
Right, Elisa, I think that was one of the examples we use with that is, if you hire a licensed electrician in Utah, he's going to have the same skills to be a licensed electrician in Ohio, so moving us all towards, a unified preparation, I think is important. I also, before we move on, Kathy Crow just put in the chat box as well that she loves that the word play is being added to standard 4.
Excellent.
Kim, I have one. This is Pam. I have one other one that kind of came to me, and if the person wants to ask, but they kind of were talking about when we said it's for all children, there was the question, are these specific to birth to 3? We know we're saying that teacher prep is birth to age 8, but how are these addressing the gap that we have currently with the birth to 3 preparation.
So when someone's saying birth to 3, are they saying birth to age 3 or birth to
Correct.
grade 3?
Birth to age 3, because currently in Ohio, as you said, we have a pre-K to 5th grade license, and it's not specific to the important years of development, not that they're not all, but the birth to age 3. So the question was kind of around the fact that when we say it's for all children, all settings, this teacher prep, how is this specifically preparing teachers to be ready to work with children birth to age 3?
So there will be an expectation, and 0 to 3 being at the table, they're the ones whose voice is strongest in that work. But we have a lot of researchers as well who, we all agree the importance of those years, but we haven't gotten to a point where we've convinced society, nor have we convinced those who hold the purse strings that birth to age 3 is so important. So the underlying resources that are going to be provided, as well as the next resource that will come after these standards are approved, there will be guidelines for teacher preparation programs that will be specific around, what kinds of coursework will need to be offered that is specific to infants and toddlers. So it's very much a part of the conversation and kind of the back dialogue that is happening to make sure that the structures are going to be in place so that we do fill that gap that is birth to age 3. But we also have a gap that is kindergarten to grade 3. So similarly, we've got advocates at the table who want to ensure that first, kindergarten to 3rd grade, that it is also being, more attention to developmentally appropriate practice, and assuring that what we're doing with those kids is appropriate for their age and the stages of development in which they're existing. So both ends are very important. We know we're doing a great job with that pre-K piece, but the other is definitely on the radar, not just of this work group doing the standards work, but on the Power to the Profession Task Force. And when we're talking about improving and changing the structures that are going to be supporting this work, the conversation is about infrastructural change from birth. And so when we're talking about trying to access federal and state dollars to support young children, we're talking about dollars for infants and toddlers and preschoolers, not just, for example, a universal pre-K program.
I also think, too, just kind of hearing you talking, a lot of this starting with education. So how do we educate teachers? How do we prepare them, teacher prep programs? And some thoughts going through my head with the flexibility of that practical learning being so important. So what do you typical, so like at Ohio State, I just know the requirements just because we have people come into our program. It's not very high, the practical learning that they get in a classroom. It's like X amount of observation hours and X amount of like student teaching. And then you have this bachelor's degree. I wonder the flexibility as hearing these standards and what's important for individuals to learn as we prepare teachers of that more practical based learning, that more counting that classroom time that you're spending towards coursework. You see a lot of individuals that are in the program and going to class, it's hard for them. They have to work a full-time job. They have to pay their bills, but they want to further education because maybe they want to become an early childhood teacher 2 or a teacher 3. And the limitations of that being coursework. Well, I don't have it's not necessarily, maybe I have funding to go back to school, but I don't have I have to work full time, and it's really hard for me. Or I have 2 kids at home and night classes are even difficult for me. So being flexible around that, and how can we, with these standards, with this push, how can we integrate more practice-based learning where the time that they're spending in the classroom, that's valuable, and they're gonna learn more. They're gonna learn more from that time, and if it's facilitated the right way with like teacher mentors and practical learning, that can be really valuable, and it can save, I think, because I hear all this like, this push for education and for teachers to be able to move up that tier system they're going to need to get a degree. And that's great because we want to up the standards because we want to up the profession. And that is really important. But how can we integrate more practice-based learning? Because I see all the time, and this is a subjective point of view, but you see teachers who they're straight out of college, they're 23 years old, and they've had one semester of student teaching in the classroom, and they come in as a lead teacher into some of these centers or programs, and then you have teachers that have been teachers for 15 years that might only have an associate's degree, that have so much content and understanding, but how does that factor into this? How does experience factor in to these standards being written? Because I know, like, I when I was a classroom teacher, I learned so much more about child development and even the difference between working with a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old in 6 months of being in the classroom than I ever did in any of my classes that were related to that. So I think there needs to be a place for this practice-based learning, and how can we incorporate experience into education? Because I think that's going to be a limiting factor with teachers that want to better themselves and should and have the right to, but this is going to be a challenge based on them getting these degrees.
Troy,
Yeah.
are you familiar? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was just listening to what Troy was saying, and I don't know if you're familiar with the RESA program at all through the state. But that's more of a program for like K-3 type teachers. But I think that moving forward, it would be a similar program for early childhood teachers would be really beneficial, because then you have those years on your license where you're being coached. You have to go through another round of assessments. And I know that program's not perfect because I've been a RESA mentor, and that is a whole nother undertaking. But I think that that's definitely a conversation that should maybe be had as well. I don't know, maybe it has. Maybe it has been had, but and then somebody else asked about the birth to 3 license in Ohio. And I think the only one that has a birth to 3 licensure is if you get the early intervention specialist license, because I have that, and it is birth through 3rd grade.
Yep, you're right. Yeah, and the residential, I think, is that Hillary again?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So the RESA program, the resident educator, I think would be one definite way to assure that quality preparation. But I actually even see, as we are going to shift how teacher preparation programs themselves are accredited, to Troy's point, I really think we're going to see that teacher preparation programs are going to have to be innovative and find ways to give students more opportunities to the point of that application. When we're looking at the standards, it's not just know and understand, but how are you applying these things and giving students more opportunities. You can't just first get in the classroom when you get to your student teaching your very last semester. It has to be, across the courses, even if it's just getting in for observations. And so I really think, and I know it's going to take some time, but I do see that these standards are going to shift how we're going to have to be thinking about institutionally how we're preparing teachers, so that it includes more opportunities for field experience. Good conversation. Were there any other questions, Belinda?
No, not that I'm aware of, unless, Kim, did you see one?
I think Pam may have a separate
Yeah.
one, and I'm not sure we can answer all, but maybe you could give at least some initial thoughts to it. Go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if the person that kind of posed it to me would like to add a little bit more, but the question was, how do you see these standards impacting family child care? What do you see the impact being on that part of our profession?
Well, with family child care providers are a part of this profession, and it's been identified with the task force that they are a member of this profession. And so I think as we're moving to, it's kind of like, looking into a crystal ball. What is this going to be like? But I think if family child care providers are receiving any kind of state subsidies, they're going to be required to have the same degrees as everyone else in the field. We are educators of young children, and if we want to be compensated and we want to be seen as educators, that we're elevating our field, then everyone in the field has to be a part of what's going on. So again, that is my own perception of where this is going. I think we're a long way from any of this, as we're still just working on approving these, the unified framework and the standards, and we're long from getting this on any legislative docket. But I do see that there will be an impact eventually for home care providers who are doing this in a licensed setting.
And this is Kim. I would agree with that, and I'm not sure, because we have people who have been to some of our meetings, but not all of our meetings. But I see that as, I agree with your comments there, Lisa, because the ultimate goal is that if we're going to eventually be able to make a legislative ask at the local, state, and federal level to invest in wage and compensation, that we all need to be accountable for similar preparation, similar responsibilities, so that it makes sense. So therefore, family child care providers would also, be right within the same mix of being compensated comparable to those at the public school setting. So I think, there's responsibility, but there's also benefits. And just briefly, and we can move on, but there, as we've talked about in previous meetings, there will be bridges and a time frame built for this. It's nothing that's going to happen overnight. There will be supports and financing put in place to help people, get the credentials that they need. So, but also feel free to contact us afterwards for additional information if you want to talk this through, because it does affect you personally and professionally. So we want to answer your questions.
Yeah. And Kim, thank you for pointing that out, because like some of the underlying structural things, Kim and the staff would have a better idea of, because that's not information that I've necessarily been privy to. And it is important to understand that these aren't just going to be thrown out there and we're all going to be expected to change on a dime. I mean, there are definitely going to be timelines in place. And I think our intention to share this information with you today is just to say, Power to the Profession is really moving the needle on what we're talking about when we're talking about professionals, educating those who are working with young children and families, and that this is really, important, serious business. And these standards and competencies are really going to be held high as the standard for preparing those who are working with children and families. And so in your various roles, in the context of Power to the Profession, we wanted to make sure that you had an understanding that, this is the conversation right now. These standards and competencies, and I have a slide in a minute around the timeline, but they're out right now for second public comment, including the leveling that I've talked about. But the unifying framework, the task force is planning on approving and rolling out the unified framework in December 2019. That is just a few months away. So once that rolls out, then all the things that Kim is talking about as far as timelines and all of that will be, a lot more of that will be public. So we'll all have a better understanding of next steps. All right. I think, Laura, do you have Standard 5 up now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just real quick. So the Standard 5 change you can see there. So a deeper understanding of pedagogical content knowledge and how young children learn within each discipline. Again, legislators are going to want us to be accountable for student outcomes. We live in a different world than when I was initially trained as a teacher almost 40 years ago. We never even used the word student learning outcomes, and now it's at the forefront of the work that we do with children. So Standard 5 is really around content knowledge and how we show that children understand what would be developmentally appropriate understanding of each of the areas of content, using Standard 4 and all of the strategies that would be developmentally appropriate. But this is, Standard 5 is around content knowledge and content learning, and assuring that those working with young children also have the content knowledge and deep understanding of content areas, math, science, language arts, so that they can appropriately be teaching children. And then Standard 6 is our professionalism standard. And again, a lot of this has remained the same. It has a lot of depth here around what it means to be an educational professional. The one that was added is around professional communication skills, including technology media strategies to effectively support learning and development and to work with families and colleagues. As much as I clearly do not have technology ability, we live in a world that is driven by technology, and so we need to prepare our teachers to use technology appropriately, both in what might be an educational setting, but also in ways that we communicate with families. So that was an added piece to professionalism. The other one that I really want to make sure that we understand well is 6E. We've changed that language a little bit, but we really want to make sure as a part of our professionalism as educators of young children that we prepare teachers to understand the value and importance of reflective teaching and intentional practices in our work every day. So that was a very high level, what has changed with each of the 6 standards, and I apologize if you weren't familiar with the standards to begin with. That was really a lot of information. But I encourage you to go in and look at the draft. There will be a link here in a minute that you can go and do that next round. So just some background information. The next slide is around who responded to the draft in June of 2019. So this was initially put out for comment in June of 2019, and it was open for most of the summer. And so we had 178 respondents. We had letters from the left-hand side, people who specifically addressed the standards. I was so pleased to see University of Cincinnati faculty participated in a phone call, but other focus groups. And so based on that feedback, there were revisions made to the standards, which you just saw. Those were the revisions. The most updated standards are the ones that we've just breezed through there. But the general feedback themes were the tension, the next slide, Laura, the tension over the higher level language. So as you get into the weeds and you read it, you might read it and say, ooh, my associate degree preparing students, this is way over their heads. This is not language they're going to understand. Or teachers I currently have working for me who've been in the field a while, you know, I don't see how this is applicable to them. But we've kind of pushed back on that by saying, no, we are saying that we are an educated workforce. We are professionals, and so the language is intentional in the way that it is presented, because we think it's important, and we want to make clear to those who hold the purse strings that this is a profession. This language is professional. It is academic, and there's an intentionality around that. And we hope a little of that tension can be resolved as we better define the ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3. Feedback, and you all brought it up yourselves, was to continue to find ways to include more birth to age 3 and the early grades. So one of the things we're doing is integrating examples into the standards when we're looking at ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3. And so as we're beginning to create the resources that will be complementary to the standards document, we're working to assure that there are more of those examples, both embedded in the standards themselves, but also in those recommendation sections of the standards. One of the other themes was that observations shouldn't only be around one standard, that teachers observe all day, every day, and that we want to make sure that even in standards 4 and 5, that there is an understanding that observation is an important teaching strategy and important to understand students' knowledge and growth and development. So this next iteration will have kind of more across the standards, some ideas around observation. And then there were some things around 4C, which have been more streamlined and condensed a little bit when you look at the full document. And then in addition, there were some themes on the leveling. So that draft that was put out in July, the feedback was there was not enough difference between ECE1 and, 2 and 3, which I feel has been resolved pretty well, and you'll see that upgraded document now out there and available for feedback. There was some worry that the document could be used to roll back progress because there are many states that already require BAs to be in early care settings, early childhood settings. So there's been some language strengthened around that, understanding that wouldn't it be lovely if every single child in every single setting had a teacher with a BA? So the language that you'll see now in the document out for comment, particularly in the introductory explanation part, says that this is to support and improve what is already in place. So hoping that will support this high quality movement that we have underway. Concerns that each column related to ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3 are too ambitious. And also the preparation, as Troy mentioned. So what is this really going to look like, and how can we improve field experience opportunities? So what is that preparation going to look like is also something that is under consideration. So what you'll see now, and I'm going to just breeze through this, the final content revisions is what you will see now out on the NAEYC website. The things are listed here, and I love that several of these are points that you all made here on this call. These final revisions are, they'll be moving toward approval at the November governing board meeting, as well as the next task force meeting. And I would expect that they will, I believe the current document is open until November. It can't be November 8th. Let me see if I have this on here.
Actually, I have the link and the wording from it. It does say November 8th.
Okay. Yeah, maybe Laura, move up to the slide that says status of the draft. And I should have taken out provided on flash drives. That was for a different presentation. We don't have flash drives for all of y'all. But the link is there, and the link has the most updated one. My apologies. But as I mentioned, the EC 1, 2, and 3 stakeholders convened 3 Fridays ago to consider some of these challenges that came out of that feedback. And so the current public comment is open until till November 8th. And then there'll be a governing board meeting right after that. So our hope would be that this will be published as the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators, and it will be rolled out in conjunction with the Power to the Profession Unifying Framework that will be hopefully we'll all see in December of this year. And then the next slide actually has the website. So stay engaged. The link is there for the most recent opportunity of to see the standards in full. I think what is really of particular relevance, and I'm just so pleased that got added to this iteration, are those sections of recommendation, because no matter what hat you wear, and I love that we have people from across the field on this phone call, you can go to that document and you can see how it's going to influence the work that you're doing. And as such, I really welcome you to put that hat on and to give us feedback based on that lens, because if these are standards of the field, they should reflect the voice of the field. And we really have been intentional around giving opportunities for public feedback, but we also know that, you know, when you have, you know, the equity statement out for feedback, the competencies out for feedback, DAP is out for feedback, it's just a lot to ask for people. But I think now is a really good time. We have this document in really good shape, particularly the new iteration of the leveling. So I really would appreciate it, frankly. I would love for the next time we look at this draft for them to say, wow, there were 30 people from Ohio that commented. What the heck's going on in Ohio? That would be awesome. So I really encourage you to do that, even if it's just a, man, I really love the direction this is going, or the opposite, I'm really concerned about how I'm going to make this real. You're all going to have to provide some resources for me and give some suggestions about what would be helpful, because that's really what we're going to need to turn these words into action. And the more engagement we have from the field, I think the more we're going to be able to legitimize this work. So, so offer some feedback. We welcome your comments, and we'll then move on to that last slide and just see if there are any further questions.
It looks like a pretty attentive cat there.
Yeah.
Oh. I don't see any questions in the chat box. I don't know if Kim or Pam have gotten any other private questions.
No, I think maybe, I mean, we're certainly open if you're still thinking, but it also seems like some people asked their questions as we went along, which is great. But yeah, let's pause a minute in case you know, people need to think or get themselves off mute. We don't want to cut anybody off if they do have a comment or a question.
I have one for Elisa while we're waiting, and I guess it's for me personally. I know you've been at this work a very long time, and we appreciate your leadership. I kind of am interested in your reflection to what feels different for you this time around this work than perhaps in the past, if that's a fair question to ask of you. You know, you've been working on this for a while and have committed your professional career to this. Is there a different feel or a different energy this time?
Can you hear me?
Yes. And
okay, good. I switched back. I'm thinking maybe this internet connection will be better now. It stopped raining. Yay. So I have to say that, you know, previous to the Power to the Profession task force, we were kind of like a deserted island out there working on this higher ed stuff. What I feel is different is the energy around this unified voice of our profession with all these task force organizations at the table. You know, from the time I entered this profession, we've been talking about compensation. I finally feel like I can honestly say to my students, I believe in your lifetime, in your career span, you're going to be making a worthy wage for the important work that you do. And I'm also very excited about NAEYC's leadership just in that task force, because we've always lived in this little silo of who we thought we were as NAEYC, and we really didn't fully realize our capacity to be advocates for this work. And there's a completely new energy and understanding around how we can be seen as advocates, regardless of the hat that we wear. We need to stop just saying, oh, I'm just a teacher. Oh, I'm just this little person in Toledo, Ohio. We need to stop being afraid of using our voice and getting out there and meeting with the people who are right here in my back door, who are passing the laws that impact me and my students. Because it does make a difference to make a phone call. It does make a difference to send an email. And I think the energy that has happened around that in NAEYC and the advocacy work that they're doing is what's going to really make sure that power to the profession happens, that it really comes to fruition.
So Elisa, can I add a real life example of the importance of our voice? You were at the Higher Education Summit, and there's a federal law that is impacting childcare centers and higher education programs related to the new background checks. And someone brought this issue up, and it was listened to, it was heard, but the response back from the state agencies at that time was, this was a federal law that we don't have the control over to be able to change. So the implication to me was, and that's my interpretation, so we're going to have to live with it as is. But I had just received an email from NAEYC saying that there was going to be a listening tour from the federal Children, Youth, and Families. And so I shared that and said, if this is a real issue to you, higher ed, then someone needs to show up at this forum and share the issue. And I was so excited because one of the faculty members did show up, did end up sharing it with the federal officials, and they actually that day asked her to share it with the full group because she had shared it in a small setting. And childcare centers started adding in the issues they were having, and it was a demonstration. They talked about how the federal agency and the state agency were going to come together to discuss what issues would need to be changed at the federal level, what would need to be changed at the state level to make this work for those on the ground. So to me, it's not pie in the sky for us to say someone's voice can make a difference in moving this.
That's a great example. Great example.